Call David Clendon.
Mr Chair, as we go through this, what I suspect will be quite a brief committee stage of this bill, it's worth just reflecting on the progress of the bill overall through the House, which has been rather a stop-start, sort of hurry-up-and-wait affair. It was introduced in May last year. 3 days later, we found ourselves in the midst of the first reading, having had very little time to look at a bill that does affect quite a range of primary legislation, some quite elaborate and some quite important changes being proposed here, and 3 days we had before the first reading. We then went off to Select Committee, of course, and that was a 6-month process, which is as it should be, and I'll make some more comments about that process later. And then we sat on it for some 8 months. Nothing happened. And now here we are entering urgency. This bill is named on the urgency motion, and we'll be doing the third reading tomorrow, I suspect, in urgency. So I'll just reflect on the fact that it's been a very strange process of getting this bill through the House, and one does wonder why it's been such a disjointed affair. As I say, great rush to start, then a considerable period of nothing going on, and now we are entering urgency to get through the remaining stages of this bill. So our primary, our major objection to this bill is that, as Mr Goff has just said, it won't actually do a great deal. It will have some effect around the margin, but it won't make any substantive or substantial change to the outcomes of bail hearings. There will be 1 or 2 decisions that may be swayed by it. And that, in a sense, is unfortunate, because we probably do need to have a hard look at some of the admitted shortcomings of some bail decisions. A very, very small number, it must be said, in the context of some tens of thousands of decisions that are made each year by our judiciary. But nevertheless, some of the consequences have been severe and tragic. This bill is it's a meddling bill. It's a fiddling around the edges sort of an approach, and one only has to look at the way in which it's laid out, the provisions of the bill. They're very bitsy. They're a tweak here, a shift here, none of them actually contributing much to the stated aims of the bill, the stated objectives of the bill. But nevertheless, there we are. That's what we're confronted with. We had a large number of submissions to this bill, something in excess of 280, and a large number of oral submissions to the bill. And I have to say that sitting on that Select Committee, we heard some very painful stories, some genuinely tragic stories of people who had lost loved ones. But it has to be said that in amongst the very real hurt and the very real sadness of some of those contributions, we also saw a great deal of political theatre carried out. Submitters basically being shepherded through and handed their script and sent on their way at the completion. It wasn't a happy way to see a Select Committee being treated, in fact. As I say, the political theatre that did surround some of the processes, some of the, particularly the submission process around this bill, it almost belittled the very genuine hurt and the tragedy of those people who were genuinely and directly affected by some of the bail decisions that had very poor, very bad consequences in the long run. So I think it has to be acknowledged that a lot of those people who did make submissions in a genuine way will actually be disappointed when in a year or 2 they see that this bill won't actually make a great deal of difference. And I'll say more about some of the alternative approaches we might take in a later reading, which of course will be tomorrow morning. So in terms of some of the specifics of the bill, our primary objection to it is it does extend the reversal, the onus of proof. So no longer will people necessarily be deemed innocent until proven guilty. It expands and extends the situations where the so-called reverse onus of proof, where people are obliged to prove they will not reoffend if they are allowed bail. And that's quite a peculiar notion when you think it through. How does one prove what one will or will not do in the future? I disagree with some of the Labor spokespeople. I think this does reduce judicial discretion. The pressure will be on the judges to not only think long and hard, because I'm sure they do that anyway, but I do think it does reduce the range of options available to them in a number of ways, and I do think that's unfortunate. I think there were some improvements made in the Select Committee, and I do compliment the Select Committee for that worked actually very hard on this bill, I know that. And there were some useful changes made. The business about youth, the removal of the Class B provisions, It is a better bill, but it's certainly still, Mr. Chair, the bill is not yet at a place where we could even contemplate supporting it. Because, as I said, the reverse burden of proof, that's a significant shift. That does contravene our own New Zealand Bill of Rights, Section 24B from memory. It puts us in a very tenuous position in relation to our having signed a number of international agreements and conventions, and in return for very little positive result. We can't expect much at all of this bill in terms of eliminating or even reducing some of the real tragedies that can occur if the outcomes of a bail decision go horribly wrong. So I will comment briefly on a couple of the proposed SOPs, the amendments. Regrettably for Mr Prosser, we certainly will not be supporting either of his amendments, which we think looks at a bad bill and proceeds to make it worse, or to endeavour to make it worse. We see no benefit in those, no value in them. Quite to the contrary, we think that they're very regressive and that they actually add nothing to the bill. We do see value and common sense, in fact, in some of the changes around electronic monitoring for bail. Clearly that's a technology whose time has come. We see it as a means where bail actually can be, in a sense, less restrictive, enabling people a degree of freedom of movement. And no doubt those technology changes over time will allow us to take a somewhat different, expand the range of options, I guess, available to us, to ensure that people's movements are constrained, but also to allow perhaps a greater level of freedom. Because it's no small matter to be holding people on bail for longer. And that's one of the key issues that this bill fails to address, that in part our objection to toughening at the bail is recognising that court processes are now so slow very often that it's not uncommon for people to be sitting in bail, or rather in custody, for 18 months at a time. 12 to 18 months is by no means unusual for a drug case. And we have to remember that a large number of those people actually are then found not guilty, they are not convicted, and yet they've spent a year or more in custody. They've probably lost their employment, they've probably lost their place in society, all sorts of negative effects on their families, on their friends, significant social and personal, indeed financial effects to no good end. And we think that's really not a particularly helpful or a positive way to go. It's clear that the provisions of this bill are almost in a sense wanting to treat bail as part of the punishment, using bail as a punitive mechanism, and bail should never be that. Bail should be given, should be allowed unless there's compelling reasons not to. This bill tightens the bail provisions, but not in a helpful way, not in a strategic way. It's a very piecemeal approach. It's a very reactive approach, and one which we think will not actually make significant difference, will not dramatically affect outcomes, won't achieve the stated goals of making society safer. It won't serve the integrity of the judicial system or the bail system even, because you cannot improve the integrity of anything by taking this piecemeal, incremental approach that really is reactive. It doesn't, we don't believe it'll do any good. It does do some harm, and for those reasons, we won't be supporting this bill.
Mr Chair.
I call Brendan Horan.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Sir, there have been 6 bail amendment acts in less than